The morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle, as 10-year-old Prince George pressed his small face against the cold window of his bedroom. Below in the courtyard, he could see the familiar red-coated figure of Captain James Mitchell making his morning rounds. The young prince had watched this same routine for as long as he could remember, finding comfort in the steady presence of the royal guard, who always seemed to notice when George waved from his window. Captain Mitchell had served the royal family for 15 years, earning his position through exceptional service and unwavering dedication. At 42 years old, he carried himself with the dignity expected of someone protecting the future king. Yet there was something gentle in his eyes that made the younger royals feel safe rather than supervised. His thick brown hair was always perfectly groomed beneath his ceremonial hat, and his posture remained straight even during the longest ceremonies. George had always been a quiet child, preferring books and puzzles to the loud games his younger siblings enjoyed. While Princess Charlotte delighted in commanding attention and Prince Louis charmed everyone with his mischievous antics, George often felt overwhelmed by the constant scrutiny that came with being the eldest. He found solace in small moments of normalcy, and Captain Mitchell had unknowingly become part of that comfort. The relationship between the young prince and his guard had developed naturally over the years. It began with simple nods of acknowledgement when George would appear at windows or in doorways. Captain Mitchell, understanding the weight that already rested on such young shoulders, had made it his personal mission to ensure George felt secure in his environment. He would time his patrols to pass by the library when he knew the prince was reading, offering a reassuring smile that said everything would be all right. During public events, when the cameras flashed and the crowds pressed forward, Captain Mitchell positioned himself where George could always see him. The young prince had learned to find that familiar face in the sea of strangers, drawing strength from the steady presence of someone who expected nothing from him except to be himself. There were no lessons to learn, no protocols to remember, just the quiet understanding between a child who carried the weight of a nation's future and a man dedicated to protecting that innocence for as long as possible. The other guards had noticed this special dynamic but never questioned it. They understood that their captain possessed a rare ability to balance professional duty with genuine care. He treated all the royal children with respect and kindness, but there was something deeper in his connection with George. Perhaps it was recognizing a kindred spirit in the serious young boy, or maybe it was understanding what it meant to carry responsibilities that others couldn't fully comprehend. Captain Mitchell's own background had prepared him for this unique role. Growing up as the eldest of 4 children in a military family, he had learned early what it meant to be responsible for others. His father, a decorated army officer, had taught him that true strength came not from commanding attention but from providing stability when others needed it most. His mother, a teacher, had shown him how to communicate without words, how to offer comfort through presence rather than speeches. When Captain Mitchell first joined the Royal Protection Team, he had been assigned to various duties around the palace. But it was during a family gathering 3 years earlier that he first truly connected with Prince George. The young prince, then 7 years old, had become separated from his family during a large event. Instead of crying or calling out, George had simply stood still, his small hands clasped behind his back, waiting patiently to be found. Captain Mitchell had been the one to spot the lost prince and had approached him slowly, kneeling down to George's level before speaking. Instead of immediately taking the child back to his parents, he had asked if George was all right and if he needed a moment to collect himself. The young prince had looked up with surprised gratitude at being treated as a person rather than just a child to be managed. From that day forward, Captain Mitchell had made it his business to understand George's nature. He observed how the prince's energy flagged during long public appearances, how he sometimes needed a quiet moment to process overwhelming situations, and how he responded better to gentle guidance than firm direction. The captain adjusted his protection style accordingly, becoming not just a guardian of George's physical safety but a protector of his emotional well-being. The other members of the royal family had noticed and appreciated Captain Mitchell's approach. Prince William and Catherine had often commented privately on how much more relaxed George seemed when Captain Mitchell was on duty. The young prince's shoulders didn't carry quite as much tension, and he seemed more willing to engage with others when he knew his trusted guard was nearby. This understanding between them had grown stronger over time. George had learned that he could count on Captain Mitchell to be exactly where he needed him to be. During boring ceremonies, the captain would position himself in George's line of sight, sometimes making subtle faces that only the prince could see, helping him get through particularly tedious moments. When George felt overwhelmed by crowds, Captain Mitchell seemed to sense it immediately, creating small barriers or distractions that gave the young prince space to breathe. The trust flowed both ways. Captain Mitchell had come to understand George's moods and needs so well that he could anticipate problems before they arose. He knew when the prince was getting tired and needed a break, when he was feeling anxious about an upcoming event, or when he simply needed someone to acknowledge his feelings without trying to fix them. But on this particular morning, as George watched Captain Mitchell's familiar patrol route, something felt different. There was a tension in the air that the young prince couldn't quite identify. The captain's movements seemed slightly less confident than usual. And even from his high window, George could sense that something was troubling the man who had become such an important part of his daily life. Unknown to the young prince, Captain Mitchell was indeed wrestling with a decision that would change everything. The previous evening, he had received news that would force him to choose between his duty to the crown and his responsibility to his own family. His elderly mother, who lived alone in Scotland, had suffered a serious fall and needed full-time care. His siblings, scattered across different countries with their own responsibilities, were unable to help. The captain had spent the night considering his options, knowing that requesting extended leave or a transfer would mean leaving George at a crucial time. The young prince was approaching adolescence, a period that would bring new challenges and pressures. Captain Mitchell understood better than anyone how much George relied on stability and familiar faces to navigate the complexities of royal life. As he completed his morning rounds, Captain Mitchell looked up at George's window. Seeing the small face pressed against the glass as always, he raised his hand in their customary greeting. But his heart was heavy with the knowledge that this routine they had both come to treasure was about to be disrupted. The decision he was about to make would test the quiet bond they had built and set in motion events that neither of them could have anticipated. The captain knew that his resignation would be more than just a change of personnel. For George, it would be the loss of someone who had helped him feel safe in a world that often felt overwhelming. The thought of disappointing the young prince weighed heavily on Captain Mitchell's mind as he prepared to face one of the most difficult decisions of his career. That evening, as George completed his homework in the library, he noticed Captain Mitchell passing by the window more frequently than usual. Each time their eyes met, the captain's smile seemed a little forced. Though he tried to maintain their normal interaction, George, with the intuitive sensitivity that often comes with quiet children, sensed that something important was about to change, though he couldn't have imagined what form that change would take. The next morning brought an unusual quietness to the castle corridors. George noticed immediately that Captain Mitchell was not at his usual post during breakfast. Instead, a different guard stood in his place. A younger man whose nervous energy felt jarring compared to the calm presence George had grown accustomed to. The substitute guard smiled too widely and stood too rigidly, clearly trying hard to make a good impression but missing the natural ease that had made Captain Mitchell so effective. Prince William and Catherine exchanged glances across the breakfast table, having been informed the previous evening of Captain Mitchell's situation. They understood the difficult position he faced and respected his dedication to his family, but they also worried about how the change would affect their sensitive eldest son. They had watched George flourish under Captain Mitchell's quiet guidance, and knew that losing that stability would be challenging for him. George pushed his eggs around his plate, his appetite diminished by the unexplained absence. When he asked where Captain Mitchell was, his parents explained that the captain was dealing with a family emergency and might need to take some time away. They spoke in the careful, measured tones adults use when trying to prepare a child for disappointing news without revealing the full extent of the situation. The young prince nodded solemnly, understanding that adults sometimes had responsibilities that took them away from their work. But what he couldn't understand was why he felt so anxious about it. Captain Mitchell was just one of many people who worked at the palace, yet his absence created a hollow feeling in George's chest that he struggled to identify. As the day progressed, George found himself looking for Captain Mitchell in all the usual places. During his piano lesson, he glanced toward the window where the captain normally passed by. During lunch, he kept watching the doorway, expecting to see the familiar figure checking on the family's security. Each time he was disappointed, and each disappointment made the hollow feeling grow larger. Meanwhile, Captain Mitchell was sitting in a sterile hospital waiting room 300 miles away in Edinburgh, holding his mother's frail hand. Margaret Mitchell was 84 years old and had been fiercely independent until the fall that had broken not just her hip but her confidence. The doctors explained that she would need months of rehabilitation and ongoing care, requiring someone to be with her consistently. James Mitchell looked at his mother's tired face and saw echoes of the woman who had raised 4 children largely on her own while his father was deployed overseas. She had been his rock, teaching him the values of duty and compassion that had shaped his approach to protecting the royal family. Now she needed him, and he couldn't ignore that call, no matter how much it would cost him professionally and personally. His phone buzzed with messages from the palace, checking on his situation and asking about his timeline for return. Each message made his decision feel more real and more painful. He had to choose between the job that had given his life meaning and the woman who had given him life itself. Back at the palace, George's day continued with a series of small disappointments. The substitute guard didn't know that George preferred to walk on the left side of corridors because crowds made him anxious. He didn't understand that the prince needed a moment to compose himself before entering rooms full of people. Most importantly, he couldn't provide the steady, undemanding presence that had helped George navigate the complexities of his position. During his afternoon tutoring session, George found it harder than usual to concentrate. His tutor, Mr. Harrison, noticed the distraction and gently asked if everything was all right. George struggled to explain his feelings, knowing that saying he missed Captain Mitchell might sound silly to an adult. How could he articulate that the guard's presence had become a form of silent communication that helped him feel less alone in his unique situation? The evening brought news that Captain Mitchell had requested an emergency meeting with the palace administration. The conversation was difficult for everyone involved. Captain Mitchell explained his mother's condition and his need to relocate to Scotland indefinitely. He offered to help train his replacement and ensure a smooth transition, but everyone understood that his unique relationship with George couldn't simply be transferred to another guard. The palace officials were understanding but concerned. Captain Mitchell's resignation would leave a significant gap in their security team, and more importantly, they worried about the impact on Prince George during such a crucial period of his development. They offered various accommodations, including paid leave, temporary assignment adjustments, and even assistance in arranging care for his mother. But Captain Mitchell knew that his mother needed him personally, not just his financial support. That night, George lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something important was slipping away. He had always understood that the people who worked at the palace were there to do jobs, not to be his friends, but Captain Mitchell had felt different. The guard had never tried to entertain him or seek his attention, but had simply been consistently present, creating a sense of security that George was only now beginning to understand. In his hotel room in Edinburgh, Captain Mitchell was having similar thoughts. He realized that his connection with George had become more than professional duty. The young prince's quiet strength and dignity in the face of overwhelming expectations had earned his deep respect. Watching George grow and develop while maintaining his gentle nature despite the pressures of royal life had been one of the most rewarding aspects of his career. The captain understood that his resignation would be seen as abandonment by the young prince, even though George would never express such feelings directly. The thought of George looking for him in their usual places, wondering why he had disappeared without explanation, made the decision even more painful. The next morning brought the formal paperwork and official procedures of resignation. Captain Mitchell met with his supervisors to discuss the transition timeline and security protocols. Everyone involved tried to handle the situation with sensitivity, understanding that it represented more than just a staffing change. When the news was officially communicated to the royal family, Prince William made a point of speaking with George privately. He sat with his son in the library where they often had their serious conversations, explaining that Captain Mitchell's mother was very sick and needed him to take care of her. William emphasized that sometimes people had to make difficult choices between different responsibilities, and that Captain Mitchell's decision showed his good character rather than any lack of dedication to his job. George listened carefully to his father's explanation, asking thoughtful questions about Captain Mitchell's mother and whether she would get better. He seemed to understand the situation intellectually, but William could see the sadness in his son's eyes. The prince was learning one of childhood's most difficult lessons, that even good people sometimes had to leave, not because they wanted to but because life demanded it. What George couldn't express to his father was how Captain Mitchell's presence had helped him feel normal in an abnormal situation. The guard's steady, undemanding companionship had provided a sense of stability that went beyond physical protection. Losing that felt like losing a piece of the foundation that helped him navigate his complex world. As Captain Mitchell prepared for his final day at the palace, he struggled with how to say goodbye to George. Protocol suggested a simple, professional farewell, but their relationship had transcended typical boundaries. He wanted to help the young prince understand that his departure wasn't a reflection of George's worth or importance, but rather a testament to the competing loyalties that sometimes complicate adult life. The captain decided to write a letter that could be given to George after his departure. Something that would explain his decision and express the respect and affection he had developed for the young prince. But finding the right words to comfort a 10-year-old while maintaining appropriate boundaries proved more challenging than any security protocol he had ever mastered. Captain Mitchell's final day arrived with a gentle rain that seemed to match the somber mood hanging over the two palace corridors. George woke early, as if sensing the significance of the day, and immediately went to his window to look for the familiar red coat in the courtyard. Captain Mitchell was there, completing his rounds one last time, his movements carrying a weight that even a 10-year-old could perceive. The morning routine felt different, charged with unspoken emotion. During breakfast, George noticed that his parents seemed more attentive than usual, asking extra questions about his plans for the day and speaking in the gentle tones they used when trying to cushion difficult news. The substitute guard remained at his post, still too eager and too rigid, a constant reminder that everything was about to change. George spent the morning in his lessons, but his concentration wandered repeatedly to the windows and doorways, where he expected to see Captain Mitchell appear. His mathematics tutor had to repeat several problems, and during his French lesson, he found himself staring at the door instead of focusing on pronunciation. Each moment felt like borrowed time, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something precious was slipping away. Meanwhile, Captain Mitchell was completing his final administrative duties, turning in his badge and keys, briefing his replacement on security protocols specific to the family's routines. But no protocol could transfer the intuitive understanding he had developed about George's needs, the subtle signs that indicated when the young prince was feeling overwhelmed, or the gentle approaches that helped him navigate difficult situations. The hardest part of the transition was explaining George's unique requirements to the new guard, Sergeant Phillips, a competent officer who genuinely wanted to do his best but couldn't understand why a child would need such specialized attention. Captain Mitchell tried to explain how George processed social situations differently, how he needed time to adjust to changes, and how respect for his dignity was more effective than traditional child management techniques. Sergeant Phillips listened politely but seemed to view these observations as overthinking a simple assignment. He had protected other high-profile families and felt confident in his ability to adapt quickly. Captain Mitchell worried that this confidence might lead to misunderstandings that could make George's already challenging position even more difficult. As afternoon approached, Captain Mitchell made his way to the library where he knew George would be reading. The young prince looked up as he entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The unasked questions hung in the air between them, and Captain Mitchell struggled to find words that would provide comfort without making promises he couldn't keep. George closed his book and stood up, displaying the formal posture he had been taught for meeting adults. But his eyes, wide and serious, betrayed the emotions he was trying to control. Captain Mitchell knelt down to George's eye level, a gesture he had used many times to create connection, rather than intimidation. The conversation that followed was one that would stay with both of them for years to come. Captain Mitchell explained that sometimes people had to make very difficult choices between things they cared about, and that leaving didn't mean he cared less about George or his family. He told the young prince about his mother's need for care, drawing parallels to how George might feel if someone in his family needed him. George listened with the solemn attention he gave to important matters, asking questions that revealed his mature understanding of duty and sacrifice. He wanted to know if Captain Mitchell's mother would get better, whether she was scared, and if Captain Mitchell was sad about leaving his job. Each question showed the young prince's capacity for empathy. Even when dealing with his own disappointment, What moved Captain Mitchell most was when George asked if there was anything he could do to help. The 10-year-old had instinctively understood that this situation wasn't about him, even though it affected him deeply. He was willing to put aside his own feelings to offer support, a gesture that demonstrated the character that would serve him well in his future role. Captain Mitchell assured George that the best way to help was to continue being the thoughtful, brave person he already was. He explained that changes were part of life, even for princes, and that learning to adapt while staying true to yourself was one of the most important skills anyone could develop. He promised that George had the strength to handle this transition and many others that would come in his life. The young prince nodded solemnly, then surprised Captain Mitchell by asking for his address in Scotland so he could send a card to his mother. The simple gesture revealed George's innate kindness and his understanding that Captain Mitchell's mother was also dealing with a difficult situation. It was exactly the type of thoughtful response that had made protecting George such a meaningful experience. As their conversation drew to a close, Captain Mitchell reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a letter he had written for George, along with a small compass that had belonged to his own grandfather. He explained that the compass had helped his family find their way through difficult times, and he wanted George to have it as a reminder that even when people had to go different directions, they could still care about each other. George accepted the gifts with the gravity he reserved for truly important moments. He understood that this exchange marked the end of something special, but also the beginning of his growth toward independence. The compass felt solid and meaningful in his small hands, a tangible connection to someone who had helped him feel secure during an uncertain time in his life. Their goodbye was simple and dignified, reflecting the quiet respect that had characterized their entire relationship. Captain Mitchell stood and offered a formal salute, which George returned with the serious precision he had been taught. But then the young prince did something unexpected. He stepped forward and offered his hand for a shake, a gesture that acknowledged their relationship as one of mutual respect rather than just protection and dependency. After Captain Mitchell left the library, George sat quietly for several minutes, holding the compass and processing the complex emotions the farewell had stirred up. He felt sad about losing someone who had been a constant presence in his life, but he also felt proud of how maturely he had handled the situation. There was a strange comfort in knowing that even difficult goodbyes could be managed with dignity and grace. That evening, as George looked out his bedroom window at the courtyard where Sergeant Phillips now stood, he felt the weight of change settling around him. The new guard's posture was professional, but he didn't look up at George's window or acknowledge his presence in the small ways that had made Captain Mitchell's service so meaningful. But George also felt something unexpected, a quiet confidence in his ability to adapt to this change. The conversation with Captain Mitchell had helped him understand that growing up meant learning to maintain important relationships even when circumstances changed. The compass in his hand reminded him that direction and purpose could be maintained even when the path wasn't familiar. Over the following weeks, George gradually adjusted to Sergeant Phillips's different style of protection. The new guard was competent and dedicated, though he never developed the intuitive understanding that Captain Mitchell had possessed. George learned to be more direct about his needs and preferences, developing communication skills that would serve him well in his future interactions with staff and officials. The experience taught George valuable lessons about loyalty, duty, and the complex choices that adults sometimes had to make. He kept Captain Mitchell's letter in his desk drawer, reading it occasionally when he needed reminding that people could care about each other across distance and different circumstances. Months later, George received a postcard from Scotland, showing a beautiful highland landscape. On the back, Captain Mitchell had written that his mother was recovering well and that he thought of his time at the palace with gratitude. He mentioned that he had told his mother about George's thoughtful card and that she was impressed by the young prince's kindness. George kept that postcard too, understanding that some relationships transcend their original circumstances and continue to matter even when they change form. The quiet move that had led to Captain Mitchell's resignation had taught him that losing someone important didn't have to mean losing the positive impact they had made on his life. As George grew older and faced new challenges in his role as future king, he often remembered the lessons from this difficult period. Captain Mitchell's example of choosing family duty over career advancement influenced George's own understanding of leadership and responsibility. The grace with which they had managed their farewell became a template for handling other significant transitions in his life. The compass still sits on George's desk today, a reminder that even when important people move in different directions, the values they shared and the respect they developed for each other can provide guidance through life's most challenging moments. Sometimes the most profound lessons come not from what people teach us directly, but from how they handle the moments when duty calls them away from what they would prefer to do. Captain Mitchell's quiet resignation had indeed been an emotional tale, but one that ultimately strengthened both participants and demonstrated that even difficult changes can be navigated with dignity, understanding, and mutual respect.